Hi, this is Maryville Valdez from AWS Educate. Thank you for joining the Supporting the Rapid Transition to Remote Learning webinar series from Amazon Web Services. Educators all over the world are rapidly transitioning to remote learning, some for the first time, and we wanted to do something to help ease the transition. This webinar series was created for educators by educators who have expertise in remote learning and can share their insights with you. The series runs through May 1st, so be sure to check back on the website each Monday to view new webinar topics. You will be muted during this webinar, but we want to hear from you. So please put your questions into the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel. We will answer questions throughout the presentation and also have time set aside at the end to answer questions. Note that this webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording one day after the webinar. You will also receive a certificate for attending the webinar. With that, I'd like to introduce you to Amaurys Valdez from Queens Technical High School to discuss remote learning strategies for K-12.
Hello, my name is Amaurys Valdez, and I'm your presenter for today. And in this webinar, what I want you guys to do is to take the instructions or the ideas and tips that I'm going to give you and make sure that you guys personalize it to your own classroom, to your own virtual environment. I hope that by the end of this session, you guys are going to get something out of it that you're going to be proud about, and you can actually implement it to enhance your own learning as well. Thank you so much, and let's move on to today's agenda. So for today's agenda, we're going to go over a few things. The first thing we're going to do is just an introduction so you guys can see the context behind all the ideas and strategies that I'm going to give you guys. The next thing we're going to do is take a look at the equipment that is needed for you guys to have a successful virtual teaching environment and virtual learning environment for your students as well. And then we're going to take a look at the different applications that exist in the internet. Then following that, we're going to take a look at the before, during, and after. So different tips on what to think, what to look into, what are things to consider as you're going along through this virtual environment. And then finally, the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you guys how I actually use these tools and use these strategies with my own lessons, with my own class. And then lastly, we're going to do a Q&A session where you guys will be able to ask whatever questions you guys want if you want me to clarify something along the way as well. My name is Amaurys Valdez, and I'm a career and technical educator at New York City Department of Education. I work in a school called Queens Technical High School, located in Long Island City. A little bit of background about my school and my teaching and my environment, I think it's important for you guys to keep in mind because this sets the context behind everything that I'm going to give you guys. So I've been a teacher in the New York City Department of Education for 11 years. And what I teach in my classroom is network engineering and cybersecurity. Now, my students are a little bit tech savvy compared to the rest of the district. So that's something to keep in mind. And whenever I give my students some kind of assignment, I ask them to do something over the internet, I know that they're not going to have any kind of issues making sure that they meet that task. And that's something that I want you guys to keep in mind. And the reason being is because maybe you may not be comfortable with some of the tools that we'll be mentioning here, or maybe your students will not be comfortable with these tools as well. The most important thing is for everyone to be on the same page so that we can have a learning environment that is going to be beneficial to your students. The first section is we're going to take a look at the equipment that are necessary. So there are just three things that we need in order to have an effective learning teaching environment, which is just making sure that you have the computer that you're going to be using, some kind of computing device, making sure that you have some kind of lighting source, and then finally making sure that you have the camera. And we're going to talk about those things. I'm going to give you guys a few strategies. What is it that I do myself when it comes to these particular tips here? So when it comes to the setup, there are three things that we need to keep in mind, three equipment. These equipment are essential for a virtual environment. The first thing is a camera. So when it comes to a camera, this is something that we can find in our modern devices. So if you have a modern phone, it will have two cameras, maybe one in the front, another one in the back. When it comes to a laptop usually comes with a built-in camera as well. Something that you guys got to be mindful about is the computer. If you have a desktop, some desktop may not come shipped in with a camera. So that's something that you guys need to consider. And the reason why I say that is because if you already have a phone or a laptop just hanging around, you can use those things. It already has a microphone, it already has a camera, and it has good speakers as well. The most important thing is being able to relay information to your students. And if you have something laying around already, just pick that device up and make sure that you guys use that device. Now, a few things I want you guys to keep in mind when it comes to the camera is make sure that it is at eye level. And the reason why I say that is because if you have the camera too low, it may look a little bit uncomfortable for the students, right? They're looking at you in a different perspective that they're not used to. The same thing when it comes to the camera that's a little bit too high. So you need to make sure that the camera is at a level where the students can actually see you and be able to relate to you and follow along as you go over your lesson. The last thing I want to mention is the light, the lighting source. Light is very important. If they cannot see you clearly, it's going to be one of those frustrating elements that's going to keep off a lot of students from actually following along with your lesson. So when it comes to lighting, one thing that I want to make sure that you guys keep in mind is that the light source should not be behind you. Instead, it should be in front of you. If it's behind you, what's going to happen is it's going to create this halo effect, and it's going to be very difficult to see you as you're delivering your message. And at the same time, you are going to be dark while your surrounding is just going to be too bright. So what I will recommend here is make sure that your lighting source is in front of you so that it can light up and brighten you as the main person that's delivering the message.
So Amaurys, can I pause you for a second because we have a question?
Sure.
So the question is, from a microphone perspective, do you recommend the use of a USB headset or like a wireless microphone?
Well, that's a very good question. I would recommend just picking up anything that you have around. So for example, if you already have a headset, let's say that it came with a phone, then just pick that up and use the headset. Now, if you don't have any one of these devices and your computer has a microphone built in, then just use that. So my recommendation would be just to use whatever it's available to you and whatever is comfortable for you to use. Another thing too as well, this is something that just happened to me before setting up for today's session is when it comes to Bluetooth or anything that adds another layer of technology, that just means that there's another probability of something going wrong. So if you have something that is wired, I would recommend going wired, at least for the first session. Then after the first session, just make sure that you use whatever you're comfortable with. All right, so we're gonna move on and we're gonna take a look at not necessarily the equipment, but more about you as an individual. So when it comes to you as the teacher, you gotta remember that you are the one who's gonna shine. The students are there because of you. You are the glue for these group of students who are gonna be participating in your learning session. So when it comes to the light, the reason why it's so important is because they get to see you as a person, they get to see your face, they get to see your details. And again, the whole point here is to make sure that the students can relate to you just as they would in a normal face-to-face class session. And just remember to smile as well. I know sometimes it is very difficult to smile to a camera. It's not really a human being, but just remember to smile every now and then, because that's going to be very important as well. Remember that your students are going to be struggling, and you are the beacon of what's normal. So just make sure that you're always smiling and make sure that you have your emotions set high so that you can give it off to them as well.
Okay, so we have another question about lighting. For lighting, how do you deal with a dark room?
That is an interesting question. I mean, if you have a dark room, it's pitch black, it's not going to work. I was going to be completely honest with you guys. So what I would recommend is just try to find a room that you can actually get some kind of light inside the room. Let's say, for example, maybe take a lamp. So right behind me, I actually have a lamp behind me. So if you have a lamp laying around anywhere in the house, just pick up that lamp, put it inside the room where you can lighten up the room, and therefore it's not pitch black. If you can't do that, again, I would recommend just go to another location where you can actually get a light source that's hitting your body and hitting your face as well. But you need to have some kind of light source. The camera won't work unless you have some kind of infrared light source built into the camera system. The next thing I really want to talk about is the virtual environment. And I think that this is something that's really important, especially now. When it comes to the virtual environment, what we're trying to do, what I will encourage you guys to do is to make sure that you are creating a welcoming environment for your students. You have to remember that adults are struggling right now when it comes to their emotional status. Now, imagine what a kid, a teen, a preteen is going through in this moment. So make sure that when it comes to the virtual environment that you're creating, it is something that is a positive environment. You know, they feel happy, they feel like they can socialize, they feel like they can talk to their friends, because this is something that they're all missing, right? That person-to-person interaction is very important, and at this point, they're not getting it. So that's something I will encourage every single one of you guys to do. And one way to do that is by encouraging your students to participate. Make sure that they're participating not just with you, but with themselves as well. Put them into different group assignment where they have to work virtually, and at the same time they get to communicate with each other. They have to, they'll have their webcam, they have the microphone, and it'll be as if they are person to person right next to each other. And again, that's something that a lot of the students are missing. So one survey that my school actually did this past week, a tremendous amount of students replied back saying that, you know what, they wanted to have a week off from school, but they didn't expect to be out for such a long time. And one thing that they missed is that social interaction with their friends, especially when it comes to the seniors. So that's something I will encourage every single one of you guys to try to create when it comes to your virtual environment. So a few takeaways from this section are the following. Make sure that you use the equipment that you already have. It's okay if you want to go ahead and purchase light source, a better camera, a better microphone. That's okay. But what I would recommend is just pick up whatever you have. If you have an old phone that you don't utilize, pick it up, set it up, and just use that as your camera system. When it comes to the microphone, again, just pick up whatever headset you have that's just around the house. Just pick it up, connect it, and that is going to be your microphone. And lastly, when it comes to the light source, you don't need to spend a lot of money by buying dedicated light sources. You can just go in front of a window and just make sure that you put the computer in between you and the window itself. When it comes to the equipment, something to keep in mind is that the equipment is there to make sure that the communication is clear. And if it's not doing that, if it's causing a confusion between you and the students being able to communicate, then that is an equipment that to me it's worthless, and you should just not use it for the next lesson. Following, the next tip to keep in mind is to create a positive virtual environment. Again, we're all struggling, especially at this time. When it comes to the students, I think they're struggling a little bit more than us as adults. So just keep that in mind as you're going through your lesson. Keep their mental health in the forefront when you're giving out assignments. If you give too much assignments, keep in mind that there are other classes that they have to do assignments for as well. You want to make sure that they are in a positive mindset. And you need to try to encourage that as much as possible. And then lastly, when it comes to the tools that you are going to use, make sure that you guys spend the time to go over the camera system, look at the settings that it has. When it comes to the microphone, make sure that you plug it in, is actually working before you actually start your first lesson. So the next section is all about the tools. When it comes to tools, I'm pretty sure you guys been here before, where you go online, you try to find some kind of teaching tool that's going to help you teach better. And one thing that you may have noticed is that there is a tremendous amount of tools online, different web applications that you can use. So basically, when it comes to this section here, I just want to make sure that you guys keep a few things in mind. If you happen to be in this situation where you're looking for some kind of tools, you don't find the one that you want, and therefore you go back into that searching mode. Remember that there is no perfect tool. Trust me, I've been there. I've been searching hours on the internet looking for that perfect tool. Once I thought that I did find that tool, I noticed that once I used it, it didn't meet my expectations. So therefore, I looked for the next tool. So one thing I would encourage you guys to do is don't fall into that trap. Just find a tool that will do the job, the basic job that you need to get done, and then move on with your lesson. And then if you want to play around with other tools, then go ahead and do that at a later time. But make sure that you guys find tools that you can trust. Make sure that you can find a handful of tools that you can use to enhance your learning. So this image here, I think resembles or illustrates pretty much something that we all went through or will go through if you're going to start searching for tools, which is you're going to start seeing that it is messy out there. There's a bunch of different choices of tools that we can look into. And my recommendation is look at the tools, download them, play around with it, and slowly integrate it into your lesson. And what I mean by that is, don't just go to the tool that someone recommends to you and right there at that instant put it into your lesson without actually testing it out. And at the same time, give it a chance to actually see it, for you to actually see if this is something that can enhance your learning. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we will use something, we'll pick up something, and we will use it for the first time, and it didn't come out as we expected it to, so therefore we just throw it away, move on to the next tool. Give it a little bit of time. And make sure that when it comes to the tools, you look at different categories for these tools. For example, instead of looking at all of the tools that are out in the internet, searching them one by one, think about different categories, right? So what are some tools that can help me with assessments? And just look for those tools that fit within that category. And once you find something that fits within that category, then try to implement it into your lesson. Take one, implement it to your lesson. See how it works. If it didn't work the first time, try again the second time. If it doesn't work the second time, you throw it away and you look for the next tool that will fit within that category. And little by little, you're going to start adding tools that fit within each one of these categories that we see in the screen. So for example, communication, right? So this is something that just happened recently in New York City. We were all using a specific web conference tool, and all of a sudden we cannot use this tool anymore. So now we were scrambling looking for the next tool. And again, just make sure that you guys give it time, see if this is something that can work for your classroom, your environment. And if it doesn't work out, then you look for the next tool that fits within that category. But once you find the tool that fits within that category and you're good with it, you move on to the next category. Move on to the video assessment, for example. And once you find the tool that fits that category perfectly, you move on to the testing engine. So make sure that before you start looking for different tools, look at it in terms of categories. And once you find a tool that fits within that category, you move on to the next one.
So Amaurys, let's stop for a minute and answer just two questions that came up that are really interesting. So the first question is, how much should I look to spend on tools, or are there free tools to use?
I would say it really depends. So for example, you will find open source tools or free tools all over the internet. You'll have, some of them may have limitations, but they are free to use. Some of them you will have to pay for it. So what I would recommend is if you find a tool that you like and it gives you exactly what you're looking for, then continue using the free version of that tool. Now, if you feel like, this is actually beneficial to me and I want to utilize the premium features that gets added if I pay for it, you're going to make that judgment. And if you feel like that's the right move to make, then go ahead and make that move. But my recommendation is to always try out the free version first. See if this is something that you can actually utilize and it's going to enhance your training. And if it's not, you move on to the next tool. And if it does enhance your training, you could just stick with the free version. But if you feel like you need to get the premium features, then go ahead and pay for it. The other thing I would recommend, I think in my school I am known for this, is ask your administrator if they can pay for this tool, if they can reimburse you for these tools. So when it comes to my school, I always go to my principal, I always go to my APO, and I ask them straight up, listen, I need this tool for my classroom. I think it's gonna help me because X, Y, and Z. Can you pay for this, or can you reimburse me after I pay for it? And a lot of times they say yes, a lot of times they say no, right? So you never know until you ask.
Yeah, definitely. That was some good advice. Thanks.
So when it comes to selecting tools and looking at the categories, what I would say is just visualize your normal day-to-day instructions in a real classroom and just think about the different elements that can be enhanced with different tools that you will find in the internet. And again, just remember that when it comes to these tools, anything that you identify that can be helpful, remember that this is there to enhance your teaching, not to replace you as a teacher. All right, so pretty much we are in the end of this section, and these are the takeaways. So when it comes to the presentation, or when it comes to the tools, keep in mind that the tools are there to enhance your teaching. You are the star, not the tools. And what I mean by that is that sometimes it's very easy to, just take a seat back and just tell the students, you know what, do this test, do that section, do this section, because the tools allow you to do that. But just keep in mind that you are the star, not the tools. And the tools are there to enhance your teaching. So whenever you feel like you enter that trap where you are constantly relying on this particular tool to perform your lesson, just make sure that you reflect on it and go back to the basic, which is you are the one running the show. The next takeaway is to make sure that you don't get any tool that's too complicated. If it takes too much effort to actually make it work, to me, it's not worth it. Again, the tools are there to enhance your teaching. It's not there to give you an extra responsibility or an extra thing to keep in mind along with everything else that comes with teaching. There will never be a perfect tool. And this is something that I went through. I am a tech fanatic, and I'm always searching for the next best thing. And one thing I realized is that, it's like a fever, you really want this thing. And then once you actually get it, the fever dies out and you're looking for the next item. So when it comes to the tools, it's the same thing. The same concept applies. You will never find the perfect tool. So just make sure you guys keep that in mind as you're searching through the internet to find something that will enhance your learning. We're going to move on to the next section. And in this section, we're pretty much looking at the beginning, middle, and end when it comes to a virtual learning environment. So when it comes to the virtual learning environment, there are 3 phases to it. And the first phase is before your sessions. A few things that you guys should do, and I would recommend you to do before your session starts. The first thing is to create rules and expectations. This should be something that you should have done on the first day of the course, but I will also recommend that you reinforce the rules and expectation every other day or every day maybe as well. So when it comes to the rules and expectation, as you guys already know, sometimes the students will forget about it, or they'll get a little bit too comfortable and they will forget about these rules that you set in the beginning. So this is something that you guys, that you should actually do. And just make sure that you review your own rules and expectations that you set in the beginning of the classroom. And if you didn't set that, then this is the perfect time to actually create one and make sure that you deliver it to your next session. Another piece of advice to consider is taking a look at the agenda or lesson plan before each session. So make sure that you have some kind of agenda so you know what you're going to be covering on that day. This is the same thing as having a lesson plan. So when it comes to online teaching, you should have a lesson plan as well, just like you would in a face-to-face classroom environment. The difference between the lesson plan in a virtual environment versus a classroom environment, at least from my perspective, is that when it comes to the virtual environment, it doesn't have to be too detailed. It's just there for you to track yourself and make sure that you are on time when it comes to each section that you need to cover on that particular day. Check your hardware. Again, this is something that we all go through, and hardware they can go wrong sometimes. And make sure that you test them before your class session starts. Trust me, this happened to me a lot of times where I thought that everything was connected or everything was working, and then in the last minute, this is when I connect everything. I connect to the session, and I'm scrambling trying to figure out what's going on because I cannot communicate with my students. So just make sure that you guys set time to check your equipment. Make sure everything is working before the session starts. And then finally, make sure that you find a quiet space. If you cannot find a quiet space, make sure that you demand silence from those around you. If you don't prioritize, or if you don't tell them this is something that's important, they're not going to prioritize it for you, right? So they're not going to consider you unless you tell them, like, listen, around this time to this time, I need the house to be silent because I need to focus because I'm delivering a session between this time to this time. So again, make sure that you find a quiet space, and make sure that you demand silence if you cannot find that quiet space. So when it comes to during the session on this particular phase, what I would say is prepare your desktop environment. And what I mean by that is take a look at your desktop. If you have any folders or files there, just make sure that you remove it. If you are in Windows, just make sure that you right-click it and make sure that you hide all of the desktop items. Another tip that you can do is just create a folder and drag everything you have on the desktop into that folder you created. Another piece of advice is the windows that you have open, the applications you have open. Make sure that you close everything that is not needed for that particular session. Trust me, if the student sees something on your desktop that is somewhat interesting, they're going to zoom into it and they're going to see exactly what it is, and they're going to ask about it, or they're going to make memes about it. So just make sure that you clean your desktop environment, turn off any notification, and don't connect your phone to your computer, at least not during the session, when the session is live. During the session, I will also recommend to encourage voice and chat participation. This is something that I struggle with as well. So sometimes the student will log in and they will mute themselves automatically, or whenever I unmute them, they will mute themselves again. So what I would say is just make sure that you encourage voice communication. But for those students who are not comfortable chatting through voice, just make sure that they write information down on the chat. This is important, and the reason why it's important is because, again, the students are home. You don't know if they are leaving the computer on as you're speaking and then doing something else. So you do want to encourage the students to write or participate so that you know that they're listening and they're actually following along. It definitely keeps them engaged and on the edge of their toes because they know that you're going to ask them to participate every now and then, and they will not have a chance to just roam off and do something else. The last thing I would say is take control of the presentation, and if you need to mute them, go ahead and mute them. This is something that I see going on all the time. If you go to Google, if you go to YouTube, and you put webinar fails or classroom session, remote teaching fails, you will see a whole bunch of different examples of things that can go wrong when it comes to remote teaching and remote learning. So make sure that you take control of the presentation. If you need to do something on your screen, make sure that you remove the screen sharing. If you need to go off and do something outside, let's say, for example, you need to go to the kitchen or you need to tend to one of your children or one of your family members inside the house, then just make sure that you mute your mic before you go ahead and leave the computer system. Make sure that you take control of the presentation, especially when it comes to the students as well. So when it comes to the students, I would suggest to mute everybody. And if you want someone to communicate or say something, unmute that person only and let that person speak. And at the same time, as we said before, give students the opportunity to communicate with themselves as well. So every now and then, just make sure that you give them the opportunity to just communicate with each other and just have a discussion with one another.
All right, so we have some questions. So one of the questions that just came in is like, how can I prevent students from speaking over me? So you mentioned something about muting the students.
Yes.
Do you encourage them to be able to like unmute themselves?
It depends. It depends on the session itself. So I do both. So if I have a demo where I am demonstrating something on the computer, so I teach cybersecurity and network engineering. So my content is kind of difficult. So I don't expect the students to have a prior experience for a lot of the things that we're going to do. So during those times when I'm giving a demonstration lesson, I do encourage them to unmute themselves. So I do allow them to unmute themselves so that they can ask whatever questions they have. Now, when it comes to sessions where I am presenting a slide and they have some kind of worksheet to do on their own, during those sessions, everybody's muted and they cannot unmute themselves unless I mute them. Unless I unmute them. So I have to initiate the muting or unmuting. So it just really depends on what kind of sessions you're doing. But again, if it's too complicated to do that, if you find it too complicated, then what I would suggest is you take control of it and you mute everybody and you control when you're going to unmute someone so that they can speak. Okay,
so that's another good piece of advice. So like you take control of the session and unmute the students and mute them whenever you need to. So the next question is around student participation. What if a student doesn't participate?
So, I mean, it really depends on the student, right? So you are the person that's interacting with that student. So I would assume that you have some kind of relationship with that student. But when it comes to me, for example, if I see that a student is not participating, I try to find out why that person is not participating. So I probably give them a call afterwards, or I send them a quick chat message, private message, just for that student. No one else is involved in that conversation, and I try to see what's going on. Right. So if I find out that that person is taking a really long time to respond to me, then that may be a hint that that person may not be on the computer, and they may be somewhere else, and they just left the session running as they are doing something else in the background. But I definitely check up on my students and make sure, I would recommend that you check up on your students as well, and make sure that there's nothing going on in the background that's preventing them from actually doing the work. And again, if you need to give them a call, then go ahead and give them a call. In my school, we have this protocol where if the students are not participating, let's say they're not logging into the sessions or they're not submitting the work, the first thing that we would do is reach out to them, see what's going on. And if we feel like there's something going on in the family that is private, then we get the guidance counselor involved. So that's the one thing that I really like about my school, in the sense that they do give us support. It's not just the teachers doing all the work. It's also the guidance counselor and every other teacher in the department as well. We all try to figure out what's going on. But my recommendation would just be figure out what's going on. And if you need to escalate it, go ahead and escalate it. If you need to reach out to the parents, then go ahead and do so. Or do whatever it takes for you to actually get that student back on task.
Yeah, like that. Students need support too. And as you mentioned before, everyone's going through this together right now. So interesting enough that, kids are struggling a little bit more than adults are in some instances. So great advice. Thank you.
We're going to move on to the next session. And this next section or phase is, what do you do after the session is over, after your teaching session is over? One thing to keep in mind is reflect. Reflect on your strengths, reflect on your weaknesses. Just because we did it this way, or just because we have a plan and we actually executed from the plan, doesn't mean that it was completely perfect. There's always room for improvement. So always take a look at what you consider were your strength on that session and what were the weaknesses, so you can work on those and make sure that you improve it for the next session. Next thing is collect your assignment as soon as possible. So figure out a way to do that. There are many different learning management systems that can help you do that, but I will highly recommend to collect the assignments as soon as possible and to grade them as soon as possible. If you don't do that, I found from my experience, if you don't grade it as soon as possible, what's going to happen is the students are going to get comfortable, or they're going to know, or in the back of the head, they're going to think to themselves, you know what, Valdez is not going to grade this assignment, or I have another week or I have a few days to do it. He's not going to grade it right away anyways. And what's going to happen is that person is going to continue saying that the next day and the following day and the following day. And next thing you know is that person is missing so many assignments that they need to make up. So I would highly suggest you find a way to collect the assignments from the students and make sure that you grade the assignments as soon as possible. The other thing I would recommend after your sessions is to set up meetings with your students. So you can do one-to-one meetings or group meetings. So for example, as I mentioned before, when it comes to my networking class, I have them set up into different groups. So, some people, so group number 1, group number 2, and group number 3, I will meet them Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or I will meet them every other day. And when it comes to the individual students, I will tell them, like, listen, this is a website that you can go to, click on the link, and make sure that you reserve a time to meet with me so that we can have conversations and see what's going on. Like I said before, you are the beacon of what is normal. And they depend on you to, you are giving them hope at the end of the day. So just make sure that you stay in touch with your students and make sure that you connect with them and make sure that you keep their emotions high and keep the spirits high. So when it comes to the takeaways here, a few things to keep in mind is that if you create a structure for your lessons, everything else will become easy. So that's something I would definitely encourage for you guys. Make sure that you have some kind of lesson. And again, a lesson plan. And again, when it comes to the lesson plan, it doesn't have to be detailed. Just make sure that it's in the form of agenda for the bare minimum, where you have, let's say, what you're going to do for the do now, what you're going to do for your mini lesson, your application, what's going to happen afterwards, what kind of homework you're going to assign the students. Just make sure that you keep it simple, but make sure that you have some kind of structure so that the students know what to expect every single day, and you can follow along throughout your sessions. Make sure that you reinforce expectations if you already set the expectation at the beginning of the sessions. If you did not set the expectation, then make sure that you start it as soon as possible. Write down a list of expectations and rules that you want the students to follow. And make sure that you reinforce it every now and then. Test your equipment before each sessions. If you want something, a trick that you can use too, if you don't want to do this every single session, just make sure that you leave everything as is. You don't touch it, and you leave it. And then when you come back to the computer the next day, you know that it's gonna probably work, most likely work, because it worked the day before. But still, make sure that you test your equipment to make sure that everything is working before you start your session. The last thing you want is for your students to wake up early, expect that you're gonna be there, and they are not gonna see you because you're trying to fix your computer system. Allow students to be kids. I teach in a high school, and I know some of you guys may teach in the elementary school. Allow them to be kids. Again, they are struggling a little bit more than some of us are struggling. I have students who unfortunately have family member pass away, and if one bit of advice I can give you is just to encourage them to communicate with each other, encourage them to socialize, and encourage them just to be kids and just have fun as you're going through the lesson. There's always room for improvements. Never think that you know everything and therefore there's nothing else for you to learn. Trust me, there is always something new for you to learn, always room for improvement. And the bare minimum, you should always reflect on your own work, your own sessions, and see where you can improve when it comes to your own sessions and your own performance. Collect and grade your assignments as soon as possible. And that is, I think, one of the most important things I'm going to make sure that you guys take away from this. Make sure that you grade it as soon as possible. Trust me, it can get crazy if you don't.
We have a question here about collecting and grading assignments ASAP.
Yes.
Do you have any kind of tips or techniques for making sure that you get those assignments collected and graded quickly?
It depends. So, for example, if your school already has some kind of learning management system in place, I would suggest just continue using that. So, for example, in our school, we have something called Scheduler, where we put assignments on Scheduler, we put the grades, we put the attendance on it. Now, if for whatever reason you don't have a learning management system already in place, what I would suggest is use something that is free, like Moodle or Google Classroom. I would definitely suggest Google Classroom, though. So when it comes to Google Classroom, it is an easy way to assign different assignments for the students and also to collect them as soon as possible. You can also differentiate instructions, so you can give a group of students work while the other students get some kind of, a different variation of that work. So that's something I would suggest.
Okay, thank you.
So this last section is pretty much bringing everything together. And really what I want to show you guys is how I do things. If you look at today's session, it was pretty much broken up into 3 different elements. The first one is staging, right? So it's pretty much talking about the lights, video, and just you as the presenter, you as the main attraction. The second section, I was talking about the tools, and then the last section is all about lesson planning. So what do you do before your lesson, during your lesson, and after your lesson? And what I really want to do in this particular section here is just briefly just go over a few things based on my experience, based on things that I do in my classroom. So when it comes to the staging, again, I just have a computer system. I have a regular Mac. I put the laptop up. So I put books underneath the laptop so it can be in eye level. And I make sure that the camera is facing me. And the background of the computer and on the side as well, I just have 2 lamps that I have from the house. I just have 2 lamps. I just put it next to each other. That way I can have 2 lights hitting me on my face and it could be bright. When it comes to the equipment, I use my headset, as you guys can see here, or I don't know if you can hear, but I think it sounds pretty good. So I just use whatever I already been using before this whole remote learning became a thing. So just make sure to use whatever it's laying around. Again, I'm using my headset for the audio. And last thing I would like to say in this particular section is to make sure that you smile. Again, if you are down and you show that to your students that you are unstable for that particular day, let's say you're sad, something happened, the students are going to feed from that, and they're not going to feel comfortable attending the session. It's going to be a little bit uncomfortable for them. So whatever's going on in your life, what I would suggest is before the session starts, you make sure that you show the students the happy side of your life. The tools, I use a few tools when it comes to my teaching. I don't use everything that's available on the internet. The top 3 tools that I will use is something called Nearpod. Nearpod allows me to do some kind of remote presentation. And at the same time, it is interactive, where I can write down questions live, send it to the students, and then the students will respond to the questions, and I get to see the response on my screen, and then I can share those responses to the other students as well. So that's something that I use for my presentation, the software called Nearpod. That's my number 1. The number 2 tool that I use is Google Classroom. Again, I think that's something that it's important, at least for my class, where I can assign different work for the students to complete. I can set a due date, they will get it, they will submit it, and I get to see exactly what they're doing. I can make comments and return the work if I don't think it's adequate for the task that I provided for them to do. So that's my second tool that I would recommend. The third tool that I would recommend is something that's a little bit generic, but something that's important, which is a VPN. I would definitely recommend a VPN. And the reason why I say that is because I'm sure that some of you guys are using hotspot to connect to the internet, and even some of your students as well. So that's something I would recommend for each one of you guys to use as well. Make sure that you use a VPN so you can have that communication secure. So the before, during, and after of a lesson, I pretty much already told you guys exactly what I do. I have some kind of rules and expectation that I already created in the beginning of the school year. And every other day or so, I will always reinforce it. I will remind the students exactly what these rules and expectations were, and make sure that they follow those rules and expectations. And I'm going to give you an example as to why this is important. There was this one time where one of my students, he turned on his camera and he was in a, and so in my mind, I'm like, man, this is not appropriate, So I turned off his video, and I made sure that I made sure to send him a personal message, a private message, and I told him to put a shirt on. And he didn't see anything wrong with it, but I just made sure that he did it, and I just encouraged him to do it. And the reason why I did that was because there are female students in the class as well, and I wanted to make sure that they felt comfortable. And so therefore, I decided, you know what, let me reinforce the rules and expectation again, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and everybody knows exactly what I want them to do. The other thing I would recommend highly, 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 because this happened to me so many times, and I'm sure it happened to you guys as well, is making sure that your equipment is working before the session starts. So that's, again, something I do all the time. Now, during the session, I take control of my lessons. As I mentioned before, I make sure to mute everyone if they don't need to speak. Now, in the moments where I do want a discussion to happen, then I make sure that I unmute everyone, and so that way the students have an opportunity to communicate with each other and get to collaborate with one another as well. And then after the session, I grade all of the assignments I collected. I always have a due time, a set due date and set due time. So as soon as that time hits, I make sure to log in and grade the students' assignments. So in this section here, really what I want you guys to do is take a look at these categories. And as you guys are going over the internet, find some kind of tools or think about your own lesson, your own session. What kind of tools can I use to fit within these categories? So for example, when it comes to assignment collection and submission, I already mentioned Google Classroom. That's something I recommend. But what I would suggest is, write down these categories that I have listed here on this slide and find another tool that will fit that particular criteria. And that way, if you don't like Google Classroom, you have this plan B that you can try out as well. And remember what I told you guys, don't just try one tool and then just forget about it after trying it out one time. Just make sure that you give it time, see if this is something that works for your classroom. But again, if it doesn't work out, then just throw it away. And don't focus on all the tools. Remember, they're there to enhance your instruction. So the most important thing is your instructions, your lesson, not the tools themselves. I also included here my lesson format. So this is the format that I follow every single day on the bottom right of the slide. So I do a starter. So this is a quick application for the students to do. And this is usually something based on the previous day's lesson that we had. We have objectives. So this is what the goal of the session is all about. And then we have a 10 to 15 minute session where I'm going over new content. And then after going over the new content, we go into the activity to reinforce the content that I taught in the class. Then after that's over, then we'll probably go over the benefit and disadvantages of the new technology that we learned. And then finally, we go over the summary. And after all of this is over, maybe I will have a lab for them to do, or they will have to create some kind of network topology or do something when it comes to the cybersecurity. I hope that you guys got something where you can actually implement into your own sessions. One thing I will say as well is if you want to stay in touch, I provided my website. It's amaurysvaldez.com. And I also provided a QR code if you guys want to use your phone to scan the QR code, and it will take you straight to my website. Please stay in touch. So at this point, if you guys have any questions, I will more than gladly answer those questions for you.
Hey, Amaurys, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And we have a few questions that came in through the chat pane as you were presenting. That was a really good session. How do you feel about it? Good?
I feel good. I'm nervous, but okay.
Good. Good. Yeah, a little nerves is fine. So let's try to answer some of these questions. So the first question that we received, and this seems to be a common theme, I was trying to go through the themes here, is like, how can I differentiate my instruction for virtual instruction?
Like I said before, I would recommend Google Classroom for this. I'm pretty sure if you have any other learning management system that can potentially do this as well. But from my experience using Google Classroom, this is what I do. I give my students some kind of lab to do. So I have version A and version B. So version A is, let's say, for example, I just tell them the task, complete this task, complete that task, complete this other task. And I assign it to specific students, right? So I have different groups, and those groups will receive that assignment. Now, when it comes to version B, maybe I would include some pictures, or maybe I would include a link to a video that I created where it shows them step by step on how to actually achieve the task that I'm telling them to do. And I will assign that assignment to other group of students. Right? So that's how I differentiate instructions in my classrooms, in my sessions, in class and outside of class. But another thing too is videos, right? So using YouTube, you can go to YouTube, find a video that explains a content that you're going over in class. So not only are they receiving you live going over the presentation, but they will also get the YouTube link where someone else with a different perspective, a different way of relaying that information that gets to teach them the same content as well. So I will recommend you utilizing YouTube, and if your learning management system provides you with a way to select certain students to receive a version of a quiz or an assignment, then I will also suggest that as well.
Okay, great. That's some good advice. So the next question is like, how detailed should your lesson plan be? That's a great question.
That's a great question. And I think it's a great question because it depends on who you're asking, right? If you ask a principal or a chancellor or someone who is in the, in the role of just going to different schools, maybe they're going to say to make it as detailed as possible. But to me, I think it's a little bit unpractical, especially when it comes to the online session. What I would say is just make sure, because again, this lesson plan is for you, not for anyone who's coming into the classroom. And you have the option to let go some details or some of the information because you know exactly what you need to do. And what I would suggest is when it comes to your lesson plan, just make sure that you provide enough information for you to follow along. If you feel like the information I have in this piece of paper or on the Microsoft document or some kind of word processor is not adequate for you to follow, then add more information to it so that whenever you pick it up, you know exactly what to do. Another thing I'm going to recommend too is keep in mind that whenever you create a lesson plan, you can utilize this lesson plan next day or tomorrow or next year. So just make sure that you put information or details so that whenever you pick this up, whenever that time is going to be, you know exactly what you plan to do and exactly how to execute whatever your tasks are.
All right, good advice. I think the last question, and this is really interesting because I was thinking about it too as I was hearing you speak. How do you prepare your students for presenting themselves on screen? So, meaning, and what I understand from this question is like you have educators doing all this prep to go on screen. How can educators help students prep to go on screen if they have that option?
So the way I'm taking this is presentation. So let's say, for example, you give them an assignment where they have to present a document, or do you mean presenting on the screen as in, how you're dressed? I can answer both questions. So
Yeah,
when
let's
it comes
do both
to the way,
questions.
yeah, so when it comes to the way you're dressed, again, I would say refer back to the rules and guidelines, expectations. Just make sure that if you feel like there's going to be an issue, or if this happens to be an issue, but you didn't really think about it, just make sure that you include it into your rules and expectation. And then the next time that you're going to reinforce it, you make sure to go over that particular section, right? So that's something I would recommend, because again, when it comes to the rules and expectation, we're not going to think about every single possibility, right? So it's a living document. So as the session is going on and you see something that you don't like, just make sure that you include it into the rules and expectation. That way, whenever you reinforce it the next time, you can go over those steps of that section. That's my recommendation for people coming up dressed a certain way. In terms of having a presentation, let's say, for example, you give them an assignment where they need to create a PowerPoint presentation and teach you the content. In that case, I would just tell them, like, listen, just be comfortable, have the introduction. So give me an overview, give me the benefits, give me disadvantages, and give me the how-to. So let's say, for example, again, my class is Network Engineering. So we do Cisco and AWS. So if I tell them to create, let's say, a VLAN, I first ask them, give me an overview as to what a VLAN is, simple terms, give me the technical definition for VLAN, give me the benefit, and give me some disadvantages, and then give me the show commands, how you verify it, and how do you actually implement it, right? So those are the things that I always focus on when it comes to the presentation with my students. And I find that, just reminding them that this is an informal presentation, this actually makes them feel comfortable doing it. And again, when it comes to a regular classroom, kids take it for granted that they're socializing. But what I find is that when it comes to the virtual environment, they are more than likely to actually participate in doing presentations in the virtual environment. Some students no, but for the most part, I find that most of my students are actually engaged, and they always take the opportunity to do presentations to the rest of the class.
Yeah, that can be really engaging. Do you time box the students? Like, do you give them like 10 minutes?
Sometimes it depends. It depends on the presentations. So usually what I would do is, like I said before, I have different groups. So let's say, for example, if one student is going over a topic, one group of students going over a topic, the other group of students going over a different topic, usually both of the groups need to learn each other's topics. So I don't time them. I just let them go, however long it takes. Now, if I feel like it's going way too long, then I will definitely stop them, and I'll tell them, like, listen, because of time, let's just speed it up. Just give me a quick summary for this slide, and let's move on to the next slide. Or give me a quick summary of this section, and let's move on to the next section. That's something that I would do. And again, this goes back to making sure that you take control of the presentation. But this is something I would do in the virtual environment or in class session. Sometimes, though, they will have a presentation that won't take them too much time. It's just a quick presentation. So again, it just really depends on what the task is.
Okay, great advice. So I think that we do have one more question. So you mentioned using a VPN for secure connection. So if one does not have a VPN, do you have any tool recommendations?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm pretty sure you guys seen, if you watch YouTube, you're seeing a whole bunch of different commercials on different VPNs. What I would always recommend, when it comes to VPN, at least, just make sure that you just go to do a quick Google search on a source that you trust, and just find whatever they recommend. I will highly recommend to pay for the VPN rather than getting a free VPN. And the reason being is because when it comes to VPNs, you don't know who you're connecting to as well. Pretty much you're securing the end-to-end communication. All right, so you're securing the communication from people around you. So let's say, for example, if you are in a local public hotspot, And again, I'm really saying this because some of us, we connect in a public hotspot. So if you're connecting in a public hotspot, you don't know who the person is next to you. So that person may be a higher risk than the company you're connecting to. So in that case, I would definitely recommend using a VPN that is free if that's what you have the option to. But at the end of the day, I will definitely recommend something that you pay for rather than something that it's free, especially when it comes to VPN. And again, just look for a source that you trust on the internet, like let's say, for example, CDNet or something like that, where you can actually get recommendations from them.
Thank you so much, Amaurys, for sharing your expertise with us. And that brings, oh, you're welcome. And thank you, everyone, for your active participations through the questions panes. We really appreciate all of the questions and comments so far. As I mentioned earlier, we will be hosting more webinars on remote learning, and we are also hosting office hours to answer any further questions you may have. You can find information for both the webinar series and office hours on our webpage, found on the screen and in the chat. Also, a link for the recording for this webinar and a certificate of completion will be sent to you within 24 hours. Lastly, you will see a survey pop up when you close the webinar. Please provide your feedback on this survey so we can improve these webinars. Now we will continue to answer questions through the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel until the top of the hour. Thank you again for participating and keep those questions coming.